Good evening. My name is Chrissy Thornton, and I'm so excited to welcome you tonight to Associated Black Charities Equity at Work webinar series. Tonight, we are set to talk about the impact of colorism on career growth. This series is super important to ABC as we seek to support specifically Black people, Black families, Black communities in navigating structural barriers and obstacles that have been established by racism. We acknowledge structural racism's effect on many areas, including the racial wealth gap, workplace discrimination, health inequity and access, housing policies and practices, educational inequalities, and our criminal justice system. And we're so happy tonight to help our community to learn about how to navigate some of the barriers and obstacles that exist specifically within work and their opportunities to advance at work. So tonight we are here to talk about colorism. We want to share in this very sensitive but necessary conversation, as we are aware that colorism as a practice can limit the opportunities available to Black people in the workplace. At this time, I would love to welcome tonight's panelists on camera with me so that we can introduce them and start the discussion. Ladies? Welcome, welcome. We are so excited to have each of you with us tonight. And at this time, I would like to invite you to introduce yourself and share also why you think this discussion around colorism and specifically colorism in the workplace is not only important today, but necessary.
Hi, this is Michelle Brown. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm so excited to have this conversation tonight because it's so important for our community. As Chrissy mentioned, what colorism is, but I don't know if it's something that we typically talk about. We talk about many other subjects, but I think tonight we want to dive in and just really discuss how it impacts the Black community as a whole.
Absolutely, and thank you for joining us. Sharonda.
Good evening. My name is Sharonda Booker, and I am excited to be a part of this conversation, a much needed conversation where we need to talk about this within the community. We are concerned about the Black and white racism, but we don't talk about the racism within our own culture, which is colorism, and it needs to be talked about. For those who may not realize that there is a form of racism, but I'm excited for the conversation.
Good evening, everybody.
Yes.
My name is Asia Carey. I currently serve as the Director of Social Impact at Business Volunteers Maryland. I'm the founder of the Culture Connect Group and our nonprofit arm, Crayons and Culture. Originally from Brooklyn, New York, raised in the Bay Area, California. This topic is very important to me because I grew up in very anti-Black spaces in the Bay Area. And as a Black woman, as a dark-skinned woman, I was once a dark-skinned little Black girl, very hyper-conscious, hyper-aware of how my complexion impacted the space around me, how I was being perceived, how other folks were treating me. And my intention of being on this panel is to empower other dark-skinned Black women to be proud and empowered in the skin that they are in, and to hopefully educate other people who may have implicit bias to recognize how to navigate colorism in the space, for sure.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to navigate this conversation with the three of you. So let's get started. First of all, we may have people who are joining who aren't familiar with colorism. So I'd like to just throw that out to you to gain your perspective on what colorism is and maybe how it has impacted or affected the Black community. Thoughts? Asia?
Yep. Okay, so colorism to me is a byproduct of white supremacy. It is definitely rooted in this idea of normalizing whiteness. I look at colorism as a caste system, right? So I was doing some research earlier on this topic, and there was this amazing quote from Isabel Wilkerson, where they're talking about colorism as a phenomenon rooted in white supremacy, as a byproduct of America's racial caste system. And she describes it as a hierarchy, an artificial hierarchy that determines the standing and respect, assumptions of beauty and competence, and even who gets benefit of the doubt and access to resources. She says caste focuses in on the infrastructure of our divisions and the rankings, whereas race is the metric that's used to determine one's place in that, right? So if we have racism, we have race and then we have caste, right? And if white is normalized as the epitome of correctness, of success, then your proximity to whiteness is indicative of your standing in community, right? So colorism is just it's a system, it's a caste system, it's a racial caste system that we see in the United States.
And go ahead, Michelle.
Chrissy, I would like to piggyback on that, what Asia said. So, you know, we see that particular in certain positions or even in the film industry or movie industry, where they will cast a certain, you know, actress or actors of color, right? Certain shade where and it's not about really their skill set sometimes. It's really because they are maybe of a lighter shade, and we tend to identify beauty as people who are lighter, right? Because some of the things that Asia just mentioned. So that's definitely, it shows up, right? That's part of colorism. And also even in the workplace, right? Kind of like who's being promoted, who's not. So, and even within your community, right? Within your own family, sometimes someone may say, oh, she's, she's pretty, but she's dark, right? Or,
Mhm.
it's that but, right? So it's those things that we're trying to get into tonight and have this discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, because
So,
we all grew up, the dark skin was ugly, light skin was the prize, and the lighter you are, the more I guess marketable, or you're closer to success.
Mhm, mhm.
And it's all rooted
So,
in white supremacy, and
sure it
it's
is.
all psychological.
Right,
Um,
right.
if we look at Mendel and really study genetics, and there's a lot of
Mhm.
folks who've done this research, darker skin is a dominant trait. We understand like Black features in general are dominant traits. So this is in some way, again, a byproduct of white supremacy, but it's a survival mechanism where we have to create this illusion
Mhm,
that
mhm.
white is right, or the center. And I think that some of us have internalized this philosophy, but it was very much intended that way. It was very much intended. It's like a mind trick, right?
Mhm, mhm.
So colorism is a symptom of internalized racism, right? We can't be racist as Black people because racism denotes power, right?
Yeah.
But we can internalize
Mhm,
white
mhm.
folks' racism in our being, for sure.
Right, right.
absolutely. And so we know that colorism is traced all the way back to slavery and
Mhm.
colonialism, and it's a practice that we've adapted and conformed to. And we have to believe that the things that exist in the world and in society are duplicated in the workplace. And so
Mhm,
as
mhm.
colorism exists in regular everyday life, it's also going to show up in the workplace. And we know that it has had detrimental impacts on Black people's ability to thrive in the workplace, to be promoted, to have career trajectories and more. So today we're excited to talk about this. In the past, on our Equity at Work series, we've really focused on racism and the results of racism in the workplace at the hands of specifically white spaces and white authority. And so
Mhm.
this is our first time, at least in 2023, really delving into the thought that in some ways we can be harming and limiting our own success
Sure.
and our own abilities to thrive as well. So just to offer a fact or two into the conversation, there was a study published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology that found that darker skinned Black people reported lower self-esteem, higher levels of
Mhm.
depressive symptoms compared to lighter skin counterparts. And another showed that darker skinned Black people report more experiences of discrimination and actually lower life satisfaction compared to their counterparts. So I would like to offer this question to you all about how colorism shows up for Black people in the workplace. All of that being said, how does it show up for Black people in the workplace?
Being overlooked for promotion, right? Or a particular project, or even just to be in a client-facing position.
Sure.
Because they tend to think that if you're of darker skin color, you're not as smart, you're not as capable, or you're not as I guess just not overall not well-rounded to be in those positions. So they think that you're not competent. So they, again, right, they align the lighter skin with, whiteness. So, if you're closer on that shade, then you must know more, right? And sometimes, even during interviews, where, unfortunately, skin tone can be a bigger
Mhm.
determinant of whether someone gets a job, rather than based on their educational background, right? So those are the things that are typically or can be overlooked just by the shade of your color of your skin.
And that is so true, Michelle, that you bring that point, because what I found is particularly being a development professional and having to conduct face-to-face solicitation, I felt that for me to ask for, well, for me to be hired in the industry, and dark skin.
Mhm.
You really are hiring a Black person. And then to go out and ask for money to other cultures, you're really Black woman asking for money, whereas someone that was lighter, yeah, you're diversifying your organization, but it doesn't really, you're not sure, is she really Black? But you know that with a dark skin, or whether or not it's someone of another culture that's dark skinned, you are diversifying your team. And I just felt that I had to make sure that my hair, way before the Crown Act, was not too ethnic. You know, I made sure that my dress was on point because of the stereotypes of Black people in the workforce, the professionalism. I felt that I had to always represent correctly because not only was I of color, but then I was a dark skin of color. So you can't miss, and you can't make a mistake of she's Black because it wasn't lighter and questionable.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. I think being a dark-skinned professional almost feels like being constantly on the defense, right? Having to constantly prove your competency, having to constantly prove that you're safe and that you are not a threat. I think there's an inherent threat that comes with being a dark. It's not an inherent threat. Excuse me. I want to be particular with my language. I think there's folks perceive an inherent threat. It doesn't actually exist, right? So I think that there's an additional psychological burden of showing up in spaces as a dark-skinned professional, for sure. And I think that there's, if you've been socialized in white spaces and you were never affirmed, right? But you've been socialized in white spaces, the darker you are, some, not all, right? But some individuals really internalize whiteness as their way to navigate. So they will adopt white culture. They will also do the bidding of white folks if necessary, shut down any sort of like race equity movement, disassociate or discredit other Black people to gain favor, right? Under the white gaze.
Favored? Yeah.
Right. So I think dark-skinned professionals, depending on how they were socialized, really can internalize whiteness on a deeper level, right? And I was going to say this, I know we're going to get into the question a little bit later, but I was raised in California, and the Bay Area, and as liberal as California appears to be, it is very anti-Black, right? From Berkeley to San Jose, period. It's very anti-Black, in my opinion. It's a very hostile place for dark-skinned Black girls. And I went to a college prep private school, which was predominantly white. I happened to come across Assata Shakur in 8th grade, which kind of opened my consciousness. So I was prepared to deal with like these power structures and have a critical consciousness around race. After navigating high school, where I kind of was socialized to lean into my Blackness, I ran to Howard University, where I found safety. I'm talking about I graduated on a Friday. I was on the East Coast like Saturday, where I found safety on the East Coast and with my people and in my community. And I've been out here ever since. But I recognize some of my peers who stayed back. They have internalized anti-Black sentiments, deeply. So I think that the way it shows up in the workplace, for some, is just constantly trying to stifle their Black heritage and to embrace whiteness, whether it's through the vernacular, right? Little colloquialisms, whether it's the dress, whether it's whatever. I've seen it internalized for sure.
So how much is the concept of professionalism also related to, whiteness and, white expectation? And how do you feel like that plays in this conversation? Because we're talking a lot about kind of sacrificing identity to fit in, to be more favorable. So it sounds like this is also a conversation relatively about privilege.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, to some of the points made earlier, it's how do you wear your hair, right? Before this whole movement of, the Crown law that passed, is how you're dressed, right? You have to almost like try to not look too Black, right? But how do you do that when you are Black? And even walking into a meeting with a counterpart that may be lighter shade, but everyone looks to her or him thinking that it's their show, when in reality it's your show, but because they're lighter, they assume, or when they're speaking, they're paying, they're fully engaged, but then when you're speaking, you have to like kind of, say, hey, I have the floor. So those things, right, it plays a role as well in the workplace. And, unfortunately, I'm glad that we are having this conversation, because I think a lot of people don't think about it. They just kind of go about their day, and, and not just, the white folks, but even within our own community. I don't think a lot of people think about it. They just go. And I saw a few comments coming through, and I'm like, yeah, I can't wait for us to get to those Q&As, because there's a lot to unpack here tonight.
So let's talk about a couple of the comments. One says, it talks about how about being labeled as an angry Black woman for being outspoken and assertive. So these are stereotypes that we know are related to Black women. And playing devil's advocate only, I'm going to ask this question, because colorism is intraracial.
Sure it is.
Okay, but when we're talking about working in white structures where white people hold the authority, is there a belief system that darker skinned Black people are looked at differently than lighter skinned Black people by white people?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, if you are, if you're direct or you're passionate when you speak, you're angry. But if the next person does it, that's just how they are.
Absolutely.
It's okay. They were having a bad day. Right. But if you're passionate when you speak, or you are direct, and you want to get your point across, and you don't want to be disruptive when you're speaking, it's, oh, you're so hostile.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. And the darker you are, the more angry we are. We're so angry.
Right.
We're all just so upset every day, which is not the case. So
one of the comments does say that they've witnessed where lighter skinned people were perceived to be more non-threatening and even more.
Absolutely.
Is that your experience as well?
That's my experience for sure. I definitely had a situation where I had a conversation, and because I'm dark skinned, I know I'm very intentional about tone. I'm very intentional about professionalism. I'm prepared for the pivot, right? I'm prepared for like hostile, angry, didn't feel safe. And so because I go in extra conscious, when that still comes up out of the conversation, I'm like, that's a bona fide lie. Right. And I need us to unpack your implicit bias. And I need you to give some explicit examples. I think that dark-skinned women are quicker to suffer from conduct related grievances that are very subjective versus like performance-based, right? I think that there's interpretation, and when you get into that subjective area, you have whether it's white supervisors, Black, whoever, right? It could be white or Black or BIPOC in between, but the sentiment still remains that if the employee is darker skinned, there's more interpretation and critique on conduct and these subjective areas that have a lot of interpretation than I think other counterparts.
Okay, so this a comment says that they've experienced predominantly white spaces that perceive an association between being darker skinned and having like a higher level of activism. Do you think that is the case? Kind of being a little more militant, a little bit more outspoken, a little bit more probably prone to talk about race in the workplace?
I think there's a notion like, who's palatable, right? Where it's like, it can be the exact same comment, the exact same thing, but, and this is where I think for our lighter skinned brothers and sisters on the call to understand the privilege, right? We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier about just different leaders in the 19th and 20th century who were mixed race, right? Who were lighter skinned, who leveraged their privilege for the benefit of the masses, right? Because I do think that there is a notion that if you are darker skinned, you're militant. If you're lighter skinned, you're palatable. right? It doesn't feel the same way, you know? So I do agree with that. But I also, like I said earlier, I have seen darker skinned people who were socialized in whiteness their entire childhood and educational career, be super not militant, be super not Black,
Awesome.
right?
Yeah.
And to do everything in their power to
Mhm.
disassociate themselves from Blackness.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I think there's several archetypes,
Right.
but I've seen the one that was just mentioned in the comments.
Right. And even in the workplace, not wanting to associate with someone because, you know, they don't want to be perceived, right?
Absolutely.
As you know, they're
Absolutely.
hanging with that Black person, or, you know, so
Wow.
I have to kind of keep my perceived whiteness over here.
That's the
And so,
thing.
you know, instead of bonding together and trying to help and, you know, elevate each other's more, I'm gonna kind of shy away from it because I don't want to be perceived as.
Yeah, don't want to be perceived as getting ready to run a coup. Yeah, you're right.
Exactly. Or
That's what I always say.
revolutionary.
Oh, let's not get together because we're gonna
Yeah.
be.
They
Oh,
gonna see us,
or
yeah.
two people having a conversation. There's what's going on? What
That's
do
a
you guys
gang.
Right.
That's a
Yeah.
whole gang.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's
right.
rooted in slave codes. That's
Right.
the ancestral legacy of
Yeah.
slavery, right? There was actually
Yeah.
laws that prevented congregation of
Yeah.
Black folks.
So
Mhm.
one thing we'll talk about, and we'll get to men, right? Because it's not just a
Oh, yeah,
conversation about dark-skinned
absolutely.
women. But
Yeah.
one thing is when people talk about colorism in the Black community, it's often related to beauty standards, right?
Mhm.
Eurocentric beauty standards. What does your hair look like? Your skin hue and your body shape and these kind of things. But it's rarely talked about that there are, you know, documented evidence. There is documented evidence that bias against darker skinned Black people is also related to competence, professionalism,
Mhm.
intelligence, ability to perform. Why do you think
Mhm,
that
mhm,
piece of colorism is less talked about?
mhm.
Why is
Hmm.
that piece less talked about for colorism, the competency piece?
The intelligence, you know, as we were researching for tonight's discussion,
Mhm.
you know, even in my own knowledge of the topic, it's you know, it's less talked about that being darker skin is related to being less articulate, less intelligent,
Mhm.
less professional. It's mostly talked about when we talk about hair and beauty standards and how we dress and those kind of the physicality of how
Mhm.
Black people show up, but
You
not
know,
really looking at you know, the character and
yeah.
the performance ability of Black people.
Mhm.
I think, Chrissy, I think, you know, that it stems back to slavery, right?
Yeah.
Where the darker people were out in the field or outside and the lighter
Yeah.
people were inside. So I think that transferred all the way up to even into today's society where, you know, if you're dark, you have to prove that, you know, what you're capable of, where you're from, or where you went to school, or your resume. You have to, you know, almost come in ready and prepared to explain your whole life away,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think again, it stems from slavery, and it's manifested itself into our culture in our
Yeah.
community still today. That even within the workplace, even, you know, us being in our position, people sometimes may question, well, how did you get there?
Right.
I worked hard. What do you mean? Right?
Yeah.
You know, I'm not a token. And so I kind of find myself saying that sometimes, right? I'm not a token. I
Right.
worked hard and I, you know, got into these positions by doing so. But I think that's part of it, right? It's not talked about because, or maybe left out because no one really wants to address these issues. I'm sorry, have these discussions because it can get a little you know, it's a sensitive subject, right?
Mhm.
And especially if you're talking to someone that, whether it be your family member
Mhm.
or friend, that, you know, no one really wants to talk about it.
Mhm.
Mm.
Right. I mean, you know, that you making that comment makes me think of the president's press secretary. What do you think went through everyone's mind when she spoke?
She's so articulate
Mm-hmm.
for a
Yeah.
dark-skinned Black
What-
girl.
Yeah.
Oh,
Whether you
yes.
think
Yeah,
that
you get
they
that
were
all the time,
surprised
right?
that,
Mhm.
oh, not only a Black woman, but a dark-skinned Black woman. What do you think that our culture or society said?
But that goes back to normalizing whiteness, right? I think my generation, we were socialized and to make sure that you're articulate, make sure that you're accepted, that you're acceptable. I think Gen Z. I think that's the next generation. I think they're dismantling even the notion of having to be palatable or like the need for acceptance, and like they're attacking the you can be a genius, right, and show up in your authentic colloquialism, right? I think they're kind of disrupting that, and I'm very excited, and I want to support that. But I do think that I went to the School of Business at Howard. We were addressed from our attire, from the rooter to the tutor. We couldn't walk into an orientation if our skirts weren't below our knee. We couldn't have color on our fingernails. We were talking about code switching. I don't even think Gen Z knows what code switching is. Right? No. They're in a whole different. And I support good. Right, good, because we want to normalize Blackness and its authenticity and Black genius and Black excellence. But to the question of why is it not talked about? I think it is talked about, Chrissy. I think it's talked about, but maybe just not in certain platforms. I think that, for folks who work with young people who have, who may be darker skinned, there's conversations about, listen, when you show up, this is what folks see. And therefore, you need to make sure that you are on point. I think from my lens, it's less about normalizing whiteness and proximity to whiteness and what whiteness is deemed as intelligent or as the center of excellence, but really getting back into our ancestral history and understanding African antiquity and understanding that we taught all of Europe how to be civilized. That's a fact, right? So your inherent DNA and genetic accessibility, right, is you're the standard, right? This is documented. This is documented, this is history. So I think that we have to do some uneducation. I think we have to uneducate, we have to, dismantle. And that's why you see all this movement in Florida, where they're trying to stop, certain content being taught, because when the truth is unveiled, right, it's going to shake the whole world up.
Right. Yeah.
It's going to shake the whole world up. So you are competent. And if we understand, appropriation, we understand how Black genius was behind all of these white faces, right? We understand, shout out to the 1619 Project, right? Shout out to the African American Museum in DC, right? Black folks built this country, hands down, bar none, no question, right? On all levels, the entire economy is rooted in Blackness, in our bodies and our intellect. So we know that Black genius is there. I think that the conversation around colorism and the inherent assumption that competency is associated with light skin versus dark skin, I think that conversation is happening. It might be happening in a different context though. Around like understanding true history, true facts, knowing who you are, knowing who your people are, understanding our role in the global stage. And once we get that together, our children can know inherently you are genius.
Right.
But what about
I think also it should stem from home, because I have a daughter. And you want to tell your kids, right, whether they're dark skin, light skin, you're beautiful, you're enough, right? You don't have to try to be accepted by whatever standards that is put out there. So I think that's something that we should definitely make sure that, so, when you say we're having the conversations, I think we are having conversations, but I don't know if it's enough, more so than, where these conversations are taking place.
And I agree, Michelle. I don't think it's enough, because you do have the community that doesn't think there is colorism,
right,
or detect it in the workplace. Their colleague that look like you, they're like, oh, I may speak, I may not. And they try their best to separate themselves from you. Or, you think that you were passed over because color of your skin, the complexion of your skin, and your colleague who looks like you, what are you talking about?
That goes back to education.
We're talking about it, but I think we really need to keep talking about it, because I really do think that there's some of us that just don't believe that it exists.
Right. You're absolutely correct.
I'll just bring up that in the chat, the question came up, who is responsible for passing down these expectations of being accepted by white people? And I just want to add that when we did our webinar on code switching, one of the notions that came up was, yes, we all applaud the new generation and they're showing up authentically and not really believing in conforming. But the question was posed as to whether or not their careers were, you know, growing at rates that they should be, or being stagnated because of that authenticity. So that's a question. And I know with my own generation, it's rough. Like, I came up in a generation where, you know, we were told you had to be twice as good. You know, you do have to conform, you have to dress a certain way, you have to show up, professionalism looks like this.
Right.
Because those were the things that you had to do to succeed. That was the game you had to play to succeed.
Right.
It's very hard for me, even now, as a parent of children entering the workforce, a teenager, you know, navigating to now, it's scary to me, just to be honest, to say, oh, be authentic. No, I'm still passing down that same narrative, right or wrong, you know, like be smart, be twice as good, be articulate, dress professionally, you know.
But that's not whiteness though. That's
right.
That's be African, be Black, right?
So that's a whole different conversation.
Be who we are. Like, let's know who you are, know where you come from, and know that this is our standard, right? This is not accepting nobody else's standard. So I think Black excellence is some folks challenge me on that, but I think that Black excellence is not proximity to whiteness when we unpack, right, the rigor and what it takes to build civilization, right? When we unpack, you know, GDP and Mansa Musa, who, you know, inflated a whole economy because he has so much wealth. Like, this is our ancestral heritage, right? So I think that that's appropriate. Be excellent, be great, be fluent.
Have a standard, which is in the chat. Yes.
Be fluent in multiple languges, know 5 languages, know how to maneuver in different spaces. That's Blackness. That's Black excellence, for sure. And to the question about well, let me go to the comment about Gen Z being authentic. You know, I'm 35. So I think I feel like I'm
millennial.
I'm a millennial, but to the young folks, I'm an old head. They look at me as I'm Mama Asia. I'm an elder, and I think the responsibility of those of us who are older is we have to disrupt. We have to create our own spaces and places and our own institutions and create the space where you can be authentic and be excellent, but we are running this. We've created Black businesses. We've created Black leaders. You understand? I think that there's a responsibility that sometimes gets dropped. I feel like that was the case for the generation before me, where it was just so much about navigating white spaces. It wasn't like, how do we create an ecosystem for this next generation to you're going to thrive and you're going to be free. You're not going to play this game because
because we're always trying to get to the house. We're always trying to get to the house, right? And there's only but so many spaces in the house.
Yeah.
So, you know, if I could have to push you out so that I can exist there, that's what I'm willing to do as a Black professional, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's more a testament of like the charge that we have. Like, it's more like we're supposed to be creating space for them. No, you be excellent. You study that technology, you study that coding, you study that digital marketing, you just study, you know, all that. And what we do as the older folks is we're building. We're not just staying, looking for retirement and a place for them to follow. No. We're building our own institutions at the same time. So you're going to come here and you're going to be free.
Well, let me just go down a few ways so that specifically if there are employers on the line or allies on the line, that we cover how colorism impacts Black people at work. Of course, it's hiring and recruitment. There are studies that have shown that lighter skinned Black professionals receive preferential treatment during the hiring process. They get more callbacks from interviews than darker skin counterparts. Pay and promotions, Michelle mentioned earlier, not being promoted at the same rate because there's this there's this thought about competency and performance between lighter skin and darker skin people. And obviously regular old discrimination and bias that may happen at higher rates for darker skin employees. But I want to land here and go back to Sharonda, because you mentioned in your field being front facing, right? And whether your type of Blackness was marketable for the organizations you've worked for. And so there's a note here that talks about customer preferences. And it says that in certain industries, customer preferences and biases may influence how employers select and present their employees, right? And so now as corporations, as businesses, we're starting to respond to the racism and biases of our target markets, right? And so because of that, lighter skinned individuals may be chosen to interact with clients or customers based on the assumption that they are more acceptable, right? More friendly, more marketable, and all of those kind of things. We don't really think about what that looks for, like for Black employees who have front-facing employees. And I must be very honest with you. I've been in roles where I've had white people not want to work with me. Prefer to work with my white counterpart. Have put that forward. However, I must be very honest in saying I've never thought about your journey as a darker skinned Black woman and how perhaps you are marginalized in front facing positions. So I'd love for you to kind of expand on
because
that.
you less, this is just that whole threatening, like I think that I feel that the person on the other side has to really accept the fact that you are of color. So to be of color and to be dark, they can't guess, well, maybe she is a little biracial, maybe she got a little white in her, maybe she's not so Black, but I'm ethnic. Like, you have to realize that I am a Black woman, a dark-skinned Black woman. So now you're a little apprehensive. And there's some times that I have had to go out on ask and still trying to process my approach to be less threatening, to be more engaging in a way that they would. I'm reading someone's comments.
Yeah, I read it too, and I'm like, yes.
Engaging where I can close the deal, where they wouldn't feel like, oh, I got this. Because there may be some that had first time having a Black person in their office, in their home, and I'm thinking, oh boy, here I am. I can't even fake being Black. We always have that saying that when someone is white and Jewish, they can always be mistaken as they're still white, even though they're Jewish, because they can hide that they're Jewish, but we can't hide that we're Black. So, and then it's not just interacting with a white person or someone that is not of color. It's our own people in the workplace, particularly the men that I have experienced.
Let's talk about it.
That, she's a dark-skinned female, then I had the light-skinned female. Who's the prettiest person that you want to represent the organization? Do you want the Black person to go? The dark-skinned person to go? Because what you're afraid of is whether or not she's going to look good when she gets dressed.
Wow.
Is she going to show up well? So then you get the light-skinned co-worker to represent, because she's already considered to be pretty because she's lighter, right? So there's not much that she can do. But for a dark skin, you don't know whether or not she's going to come out, how ethnic she's going to come out, because it's just that stereotype that I guess the dark skinned woman is going to be more ethnic.
Wow. I'm sorry, before we move on to kind of like the toll all of this takes, right? The burden that all of this takes on just Black people trying to live and thrive or whatever. I want to go back to something we talked about kind of in pre-production, because now that I'm hearing you say it, something that Asia said earlier kind of rings really true, that there's this concept of people trying to assimilate, right? And be less ethnic, be more acceptable. And then for some of us who are Black, right, there's a pressure to honestly be more ethnic and to be unmistakably Black. I know for me, while there's freedom, certainly in the organization where I work, there's sometimes a pressure to be more conforming to Black culture and more acceptable to Black people. How do we reconcile all of that? Like, where does that show up in the spectrum of what we're discussing?
The question is around conforming white spaces versus trying to prove to be more ethnic.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like
the
such
question.
a conflict in our community while we have darker skinned Black people desperately trying to navigate being dark skinned because that apparently isn't good enough. But I'm telling you from my, certainly not a victim, but from my point of view, there are spaces that lighter skinned people go where we feel like we have to also, conform to some expectation because in some ways, what we are and how we show up isn't good enough. And so there's this whole concept of just being Black is never good enough, right?
It's never good enough, but you know what? That's where, to me, for the dark-skinned people who don't love themselves, where the whole skin lightening comes in, right? So now they're trying to, I guess, adapt or trying to change their features, right? They're trying to, they get nose jobs or they, lighten their skin or what have you. And then for the lighter folks who they feel they're not Black enough, right? They go a little extra. Asia mentioned that, one of her friends before, they go that little extra hard to prove that I'm Black. So they kind of almost like overdo it a little bit. So I mean, that's what I gather from that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that Blackness is not a monolith. And I think that that's important. I think we need to just normalize that conversation, that Blackness shows up in different ways. One, the concept of white and Black, that's the legacy of chattel slavery, right? Before that, we were identified by different cultures, we were different by different tribes, different, so we are a very diverse people. I think our experience in the Western Hemisphere has definitely created this identity of Blackness, but I think we need to normalize that Blackness is not a monolith. My daughter, she's lighter. I was shocked. I was shocked. Okay, I was coming out with a little chocolate drop baby, and she came out, and I'm like, both me and her father are dark skinned. So, she's got brown hair and everything. Like she reached back. Okay, she reached back a couple generations. But even the way that I was raised is different than how I raised her. So culturally, right? She moves differently, than how I moved and how I move, right? And it's important for my Black daughter, it's something that I deal with, is making sure that she's accepted in Black spaces, right? And understanding that there's a popular culture that people perceive as Blackness, but that's not Blackness. That's a culture that's been elevated. Right? We're not a monolith, right? Her being Black is her Blackness, right? Me being Black is my Blackness. Whether you like hip hop, whether you can do TikTok, whether you got rhythm, you know what I'm saying? Whatever, right? That doesn't mean that's not the definition of Blackness. So I think there is something to be said about what is the definition of Blackness, and I think that the media and entertainment, industry has perpetuated a lot of propaganda. I think that there are some continuities across the diaspora that we can say, okay, this is all African. We can see the legacy of our ancestry from Africa. We see it across the diaspora for sure, but I think America and the entertainment industry has tried to put a narrative. And this goes back to us just reclaiming, our truth. We define what Blackness is. And I love the movement Black Girls Code. You know what I'm saying? Black Girls Run, right? Black Boy Joy. That's Black folks owning the narrative. Like Black Men Smile, Black Dad Gang, and that's the power of social media too, is now we get to say like, no, this is the culture.
Right.
And it's not this one static thing. Right. So I think that's kind of what we're speaking to. And we just have to have more conversations where folks know like, you can like anime. I got a student, you love anime. Absolutely. But guess what? Here, let me show you this girl, shout out to Naomi, right? Who's from Baltimore, who does anime, but she has Black features. Yeah. So you can like anime and it can reflect you. It's okay. You don't have to like anime and have them all look, no, you can have some melanin in that. That's Black. And there's space where you're accepted,
Yeah.
So I think we just have to have more conversations and check folks who stereotype Blackness, because it's not a monolith. We're very diverse.
I'm seeing comments that say identity crisis, trauma, PTSD. These are things that the burden of, even having to live this, right? Discussing it is hard. Living it is even harder. And so we'll talk about the toll, but let's frame it in your own experiences dealing with colorism. If you're willing to share any direct lived experience so that the audience and those watching can know and hear about true examples of how this has shown up in your lives.
Oh, that is, it seems like it's the story of my life as a little girl, just like Asia talked about growing up. It's just that, and I was quite chocolate. And growing up, I was called everything from Black Moses to Blackie.
Blackie.
Just recently I went to a funeral of a classmate a few months ago, and an elementary school classmate, and ran into other classmates, and ran into one of my classmates, and the first thing he says out of his mouth, when he called my name, he was like, "Girl, you were so Black." And I said, "Wow, you are a grown man missing a limb." I could have been very
audacity.
mean. He said, the last time I saw you, you were so Black.
And the last time I saw you,
and I could have said, the last time I saw you, you had 2 arms, but I didn't.
That's that internalized racism.
But I said, wow. And then I was standing with someone else who I had known, who had worked for me years ago, and he was just as shocked to hear that. And I was like, see, things never change. I said, we still have a lot of work to do, but that was my life growing up. And so then I went to city school, Baltimore City School for elementary, all Black kids. Then I go to middle school and high school, and I'm with white folks. I'm not sure how to act, because right now everybody's calling me Black. I'm not feeling the best. My parents did a fantastic job to make sure that they were always building my self-esteem, because it did. It did bother me, so much so that I was like, I am not marrying anybody light, right? I didn't want to be friends with anybody light. I said, I want chocolate children, because I don't want them to go through what I went through. Even in high school, did I date? Going to a white high school, quite a bit of Blacks, but I didn't have that high school boyfriend, because what? I was chocolate. I was too dark, because back then, light was better. That was the prettiest girl. I was the chocolate one. So then when I graduated from high school, I said, you know what? I'm going to a HBCU. And that's what I did. And then I was in another cultural shock, because we were all different colors, and I was loving it. That's all I wrote home about. Like, oh my gosh, we are so beautiful. We're all different shades, and we're so beautiful. I had a ball, and still, leading. All right, Tawana.
Yes, HBCU.
And even now, as an adult, navigating my way through, my career and through the industry, being that chocolate, not as just self-esteem is not anywhere near it was before. But at the same time, still scarred a little bit, as I mentioned before, about making sure I'm not too ethnic, making sure I'm not dressed, not trying to live by those stereotypes that not only the white counterpart would think, but also our own people. And still just recently being subjected to a Black man making choices of who represents the organization. Really? So I'm thinking we still have a lot of work to do.
A lot to do.
We still have that slave mentality. We still have a lot of work to do, but I have 2 daughters that are beautiful and chocolate, and they don't even talk about it. They have not experienced it, and I refuse to allow them to feel what I felt growing up. And as they navigate their careers and their jobs, you know, they're very much aware and woke, you know, but here again, as you say, Asia, it's that generation. They are change makers. They're making it happen, and they are disruptors.
Yeah, for sure.
So
And
I applaud them.
shout out to
Yeah.
all the, you know, the folks in industry and media, you know, who've normalized Blackness. Like I go and see all the little Black shows, and I'm
Yes.
because I'm like, I needed, like, this is healing my inner child. You know,
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
desperately looking for a Wakanda. You know, I was desperately looking for a woman king. I was definitely, you know, so shout out to the people who've created Black space and who fought in different industries and who create Black books and, you know, allow us to see ourselves reflected. Yeah, I definitely had a similar story. I think that you know, from Brooklyn, raised in the Bay, my family is also a lighter family. So there's like 2 of the 13 that were really dark skinned, and my grandmother was one of them. So there was that dynamic in the family as well. With just like light skin, dark skin, you know, make sure you marry somebody light, pinch your nose, go like this, you know, like that was from when I was little, and I love my family, you know, that's just the socialization that they went through. But for me in California and the Bay Area, that was very traumatic. It was very traumatic. And not having tools, because in California, Black folks are a superior minority. It's not like the East Coast at all. And I remember my racial consciousness really started to kick in around 3rd grade, like 3rd, 5th grade. I skipped 4th grade. So around that time, right? I was in 3rd and 5th grade. And I remember like leaning in heavy to NSYNC. They were popular at that time. I remember I had got my first set of braids, right? And I took this picture. I cannot stand this. It's my 3rd grade picture. It's like shameful to me because I know exactly what I was thinking, where I flipped my hair to the side and I gave my best Valley girl, white girl smile, like cheerleader, right? And I can't stand that picture because it really reflects like how much I hated being Black. Was called Blackie, was called Dark and Lovely in a condescending way, was to go back to Africa, African booty scratcher. You know, I mean, this is with like, not just like peer groups, there's also some of this like in close proximity, like in my own personal community, especially from men and boys. Yeah. And I moved to the East Bay for middle school. And this is where we started grouping up by race. I think Beverly Tatum pretty much outlines racial consciousness. So like you start grouping up by race. So now I'm with the Black folks. And I'm hanging out more with Black people. That wasn't a thing in elementary school, but I moved to Union City. Now we got Black folks. The thing with that was that I loved to read and I was really smart. But I still was socialized in Blackness, right? So I still was able to hang, but there was little things like, oh, she thinks she white. She thinks she white. She thinks she a white girl, you know? Oh, you think you smart? Or you think, why you talk like a white? So now I'm dealing with that, right? And then 8th grade comes, and I can't say it enough. Assata changed my entire life, right? Reading the autobiography of Assata, where now it's a coming of age story. And she touches on colorism. She touches on being, you know, intelligent and wanting to read and wanting to learn and not being interested. Like I saw myself reflected in that. And it was the thing that I needed to survive, because now I'm going to a predominantly white high school. That was the anchor for me to get like rooted in my identity. I didn't have a real image of a woman like that was on my path, right? That I knew I was going to college. So once I got to Assata, it grounded me. And similar to your experience, Sharonda, was instead of just like assimilating all the way into whiteness and just losing myself, now I have an anchor and I'm going deeper into my Blackness. Now I'm like, I'm against everything or anything that that makes me feel like being, because I just recognize this whole thing is a lie. So, and I was traumatized. So, I think some of these experiences, different people socialize differently, but those earlier experiences absolutely impact how we show up today as professionals. It was a major decision in terms of where I went to college. I have more money in California. I could went to school for free in California. George Washington and DC gave me more money than Howard. However, like I leaned in to everything Black. And that was my safe space. Like I was able to cultivate parts of my identity that were stifled. Because being amongst Black people who had a consciousness about themselves definitely was healing. I pledged a sorority, I came to Baltimore, like I wanted to be around Black folks for sure. So the trauma definitely informs the experience as professionals.
Michelle, your lived experience with colorism?
I mean, unfortunately, right, it's when you're younger, so it's high school. And I grew up in Bloomfield, Connecticut, which was, pretty mixed, but definitely a little more white than it was, Black folks going there. And, prom, right? It's prom time and, everyone wants to go to prom. But, because you're not, I guess what the beauty, right, standards, or you're not light skinned, you're thinking, am I gonna get a prom day? Am I gonna get a prom day? And so you think about these things, right? So you're going through life, as a youngster, in whether it be middle school, high school, and you have to deal with that, right? Because again, you're being told that the light-skinned girl with the pretty eyes, she's pretty, right? Or nice hair. I don't want to use the word, what's that famous fake it with a good hair. Right. So it's those things that I dealt with in high school, not being light enough, or even wanted to be a cheerleader. I mean, back then, if you weren't like really light and skinny and have nice hair, if they take you on, you're going to be a base, right? You're not going to be doing any of the special stuff, or you may be like a replacement if someone got injured. So that's what I remember in high school and dealing with colorism.
Right, because that goes into body image, right? And
it does. And that's actually one of the emotional impacts we have listed of colorism. So we've talked amongst your experiences about low self-esteem, having identity issues, body image concerns. We've talked about social isolation and alienation, and then also struggling with interpersonal relationships. So it looks like this as an issue starts in formative years and then has continued to show up at every stage of life where you're in a space that's not safe. And that's not liberated. One of the questions that's actually in the Q&A, and we'll turn to this now, is can Black men experience colorism? Because a lot of times when the discussion is had, it is in relationship to Black women and their experience with being darker skinned women compared to the Eurocentric beauty standard that lighter skinned women tend to enjoy privilege around. But it never really very often discusses how colorism affects Black men. And I will tell you, in preparation for this conversation, in talking to a cross section of Black men, none of them felt that they had been the victims of colorism. And
no,
that's your thoughts, and then we'll talk about a little bit of what the facts are. What are your thoughts about?
I have a son that's very dark, my youngest son, and he always talks about I'm dark. And I said, well, why is that always such a conversation or a topic for you? He said, well, because some girls would say, I'm dark, or because I'm dark, when I walk to the store, people may look at me, or they think that, I'm aggressive, or I look a certain way, until he starts to speak, right? So they basically judge him on his appearance before they even get to know him. So he's very self-conscious of that. And so I try to instill in him that, unfortunately, something you're going to deal with in the world, but that doesn't define who you are, so be confident in your skin, and just know that you're beautiful, you're a handsome guy, you're smart, you have all these attributes that you can bring to the table. So don't let your skin color be and I even tell one of my nephews actually said, it's funny you guys say that, right? But oh, Blacker. And I said, well, who's Blacker? Oh, and he mentioned my son's name. I said, no, never. Don't ever, don't put that label on him. I don't care if you guys are joking around. So, you know, the females get it, but the guys get it too, because I have a son who deals with that. And even I think Christy wrote some of this too, but even in, you know, dealing with promotion at work too, or, you know, being getting higher sentences, you know, more years in prison because you're dark compared to someone who's lighter. So they go through it as well, you know. And again, in the dating scene, some women don't want to date a dark skin guy because maybe they're dark or they want to have lighter
kids. Yeah.
So I think
it's amazing that there are unrefutable facts about how Black men, darker skinned Black men, face colorism. They're considered more aggressive. They're considered more prone to criminality. They're considered hyper masculine, right? They are considered less intelligent, right? They are considered to have less emotional intelligence and range of ability to be sensitive and empathetic. These things are all evidenced, as you mentioned, in racial profiling, in the criminal justice system, at work, in front-facing positions. So why is it that it just, and research shows that Black men tend not to relate to colorism? Why is it that they can be numb to what we know is something that is experienced by darker skinned men?
I mean, maybe some of them can't, maybe they, you know, they've come to accept it. I mean, you know.
Is it normalized and then it's just, okay.
You know, I mean, that could be it too.
Yeah. And maybe it doesn't affect them as much as it does us. And they may just like, well, it is what it is, you know?
I think Black men have a lot to navigate. I think there's way more that is happening. This may not be the priority to be unpacked. You know, there's a lot of, you know, we see trauma on social media. So it could just be like, okay, I could deal with that. Let me deal with just being Black. You know what I'm saying? Deal with being a Black man. That's the conversation I'm ready to center myself to. And I just want to, you know, speak to Michelle's point about her son. One thing that I'm thinking about, even with the Blackie comment, right? What I like some tools, because I wasn't good with comebacks at all. I would go to my mom crying. She from Brooklyn, and was raised. So she had,
she was ready.
I was born, I was in Cali. So my mom, she don't play, and she's an Aries. But anyway, I would come to her with my excuse me, concerns. But a comeback that I think about now is Malcolm X. He has a speech. Sorry for coughing, y'all.
Okay.
He says, who taught you to hate yourself? That's a comeback. I'm Black. What are you? Who taught you to hate yourself? You understand? Like, you gotta flip that. Yes, and I'm proud. Do you know who you are? Right? Yeah, like, there's a whole speech. You know what I'm saying? So we can Google it on YouTube, where we have leaders before us. Because even when I went to an elder concerned about me being dark as a child, and the feedback was, as you get older, you'll get lighter.
Wow.
That's not the feedback. Yeah, I need to swallow something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No. And I mean, it's just part of this conversation about how this issue just travels in our, you know, in our own consciousness, how, you know, what we have the capacity to even think about and to fight against, you know, what battles we choose. And so someone mentioned in the comments that men tend to be less emotional. So, you know, and in some cases, men also tend to be more confident. Black men, as well as, you know, all men. And I read a study once that talked about how Black women show up. And it said, like, we have to be fully qualified before we'll apply for jobs. We have to feel like we are the best before we pursue opportunities. And so there's a little bit of that, like, confidence thing that exists within women that maybe show up a little bit different for darker skinned Black men.
And socialization is real. Pathology is real, right? So we really have dealt with real trauma as a people, right? If you're American descendant of slavery, not just American, even in the Caribbean, in
Mhm.
South America, you know, we've dealt with like real trauma, and part of our survival mechanism, there was intentional structures to emasculate Black men
Mhm.
for generations. Not just like, I'm talking about like public displays,
Mhm.
castration, the whole shebang.
Mhm.
So there's, and as women and as mothers, understanding how to, you want your child to survive. So there's certain skills or mannerisms or act like you don't know nothing, and you can't show up like you smart. You can't, because there's a fear, right? And I just want to give a kudos, a shout out to Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. They just had an event the other day, and it was called Fear of a Black Planet. And it's a lot of the which is I think from a Public Enemy record, but a lot of the things that we are experiencing is rooted in white folks' fear, right? Of a Black planet, from a genetic standpoint, from a competency standpoint, from a genetic annihilation standpoint. So, you know, Black men have been socialized historically to not be threatening. You know, that's your way. Even when we talk about how do you deal with police. So there's some psychological stuff going on where, again, like I said, there's layers of like, what part of the conversation do we can only address so much, you know, but I think that we have to unpack that as mothers, as women, right? Where do we stand up and say, okay, don't worry about it, we'll have the conversation.
We'll take that on. Yeah. So one of the comments says that exactly what you said, and it says that because of the targeting of Black men through colonialism, white supremacy, that their survival tolerance is really high. And so that's something to think about. What I want to do is shift right now. We have questions, but also we want to make sure that we leave the discussion giving some guidance on how to navigate this as a structure in the workplace and in life. But you know, to really look at how Black people can recognize colorism, how they can and should react to it when they recognize it, and then how do you navigate it specifically in the workplace. And so I'm going to go to the Q&A, and one of the questions that says, Black people in leadership also administer or, you know, are, you know, authors of colorism. Why do we think that is? Because I think it is important to understand why. And let's go to the resolution. Why would Black people marginalize other Black people? Let's get to the root of, if we can very quickly, why we think that is an issue.
Proximity to whiteness, internalized racism,
limited opportunity, right? Like fighting for crumbs is a thing, right?
I think always working within a structure, feeling like you're working within a structure that has this notion of limited resources. That's, to me, that goes back to, everything goes back to education. And I think power, we have to dismantle this notion of power. It's all a mind trick. This notion that power equals whiteness and or proximity to whiteness. We have to dismantle that. And I think that when you have folks in leadership, they feel like this is their access to power. And they don't want anybody threatening that. And this goes back to the point earlier about darker skinned folks seeming like being more militant. My mom, she's in law school, she's going in her second year. And I went to Baton Rouge to go visit her when she first got down there. And there definitely was a sentiment of like, don't come down here from up north, okay, causing no trouble. Like, it wasn't the friendly, my folks are from the South, they're from South Carolina,
Right.
You know, but it wasn't that. It was definitely like, don't come disturbing these good white folk, right? Don't come. And I've experienced that in my profession. Don't make these good white folk upset, okay? They will sacrifice me, okay?
Yeah.
Because you're gonna mess up my thing. They're gonna think we in this together.
Absolutely. And also, I think the system is designed in workplaces to put Black people against one another.
Oh,
Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay, so we
You
agree on
can't
that.
conquer what's not divided.
Oh, wow.
You can't
That's
conquer. Go ahead and
right.
put that in your notes, y'all. You can't
Yeah.
conquer what's not divided.
Mhm,
Okay.
mhm.
So here we have two questions that lead us into our wrap up, which is number one, how do we break the chains of colorism, right?
Yeah.
And then the second question is about what are the suggestions to respond to colorism in the workplace? And the example given is like perhaps when you're outperforming a lighter counterpart, but not given opportunities for advancement. And so those questions both kind of go into our wrap up of how should Black people navigate colorism in the workplace? And before you start to formulate your answers, I think there's responsibility. When we talk about white oppression, we always talk about the need for them to use their privilege to heal and solve the problem. And I think even in this conversation, there's a need for lighter skinned people to use their privilege to start to heal some of this. So
Mhm.
how should Black people recognize, react to, and navigate colorism? What's the guidance that you would give? And then I can add in some of the research. Who wants to go first?
I think we have to get back to community outside of, I think the church was an anchor institution for us for generations. And I think that we've seen a decline in church attendance. And I think that as that we've lost these independent institutions where we can connect. I think that integration also dismantled and disrupted some of the organic Black community that we had back in the day, when you have folks in community, they, in stores, in schools together. So I think that to dismantle colorism, we need to have more spaces outside of a corporate setting, outside of a work setting, where Black folks can be in community with one another.
Yeah.
Right? Where we're having these conversations, where we're educating each other, collectively. And we're getting back to this level of accountability towards one another. One thing I want to say to that real quick is that I think as a dark-skinned Black woman, my competency is something that I've always had to keep chiseled. I've always had to chisel with my competency, while some of my lighter-skinned peers, have not needed to do that, right? They've been able to navigate spaces based off of beauty standards or based off of, proximity to whiteness, et cetera. So I think, yes, you have lighter skinned Black people who need to advocate and leverage their privilege, but then there's also dark skinned Black women, and I'm in positions of power, where when I see a sister or a brother who's lighter skinned and they kind of moving a little like you ain't tight, it's also my responsibility to pull them up offline and make sure, like, listen, let's tighten this up and let me show you how. Here's how you write that email. Here's how you need to come at this time. So
here's how we show up in alignment.
We need to show up in alignment. And I think that has to happen in community outside of corporate spaces.
Right. Yeah, but I think also within the workplace, I think is not letting people feel, threatened, right? That whole, there's only space for just one of us, or if you do certain things, then, you may push me out of this position. So I think it's really just embracing each other and making sure that one doesn't feel inferior to the other, and just working, someone put ERG, I think some companies have that, but that is one place to start, right? Getting involved with different groups within your company, your organization, that speaks to Black folks, right? How to partake and collaborate, work in a collaborative effort, whether it be on a project or to just help each other, right? Help each other up. It's not just, don't pit, have them pit you against each other. It's really more to embrace your Blackness and trying to help each other, because you're fighting the same struggle, whether you realize it or not.
Right, but that's the issue, though. That's the issue, that they don't realize they fight the same struggle.
Yes, exactly.
They don't realize that they have to be receptive and, education, but they're like, wait a minute, I'm not on this Black track.
Right.
No.
And you're like,
and that's when we talk about mentorship, sponsorship, these things, because I don't know that we realize as community that we're fighting the same battles. We're so busy fighting that we're fighting alone without, the power of our collective,
you gotta
struggle.
get that back.
And we have to figure out how to get that. So some of the comments are talking about raising our consciousness, creating community. Someone asked about the benefit of a safe space of an employee resource group. You know, I'm conflicted on that. I won't share my opinions on employee resource groups. I think they're in place. Well, I guess I will share. I think they are in place sometimes to take on the accountability for healing obstacles that they shouldn't be responsible for healing in the workplace. But I also think that a lot of times, while they're better than nothing, that they're still job sanctioned, they're corporate sanctioned. Like the thought about that Asia brought forward of building community external to the corporation and external.
because if you start talking about the movement,
they're gonna be like, oh, she's starting to cool.
But I do think that there's power in ERGs and in affinity groups, but I think as a mobilizing entity, however, I think from a strategic standpoint, right, if they're already mobilized, you get organized away from the white gaze, right? That's something that we're doing in community. We have relationships with each other, right? It's not happening in the corporate space. So I think there's a role, right? But there's a strategy too. Yeah. So I'm for affinity groups. I'm for Black spaces in-house, and if there's room to mobilize, if folks are really about that action, I'll tell you this. I went to a predominantly white school. I called an all Black caucus meeting in high school. All Black, right? We had to be behind the library. I mean, folks were losing their mind. Okay, they was losing their mind. However, we organized the protest. And there was one Black girl who didn't participate, right? And she was going through her own racial identity piece. But I think that if you're ready to put power and sacrifice behind the organizing in-house and understanding this is connected to folks' livelihood, then go for it, right? If you're not ready to do that, mobilize, in there, and then come into community and leverage community, right, to help put some of that pressure internally.
Someone mentioned in the chat earlier, the popular quote, all skin folk aren't kinfolk, right? Is it possible, I'm just putting this out to be, devil's advocate, is it possible that everybody can't go?
That's a fact.
That's right.
That's a fact.
More detrimental to the collaborative relationship we need to build as Black people.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have historical accounts.
Yes.
Marcus Garvey. We have, y'all saw Judas and the Black Messiah. Fred Hampton. We have documented accounts of informants. We have FBI informants, literally. COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program that was designed to dismantle Black movement, right? So this is why it's important to be a student of history, because nothing is new under the sun. Everybody can't go, right? There needs to be some litmus tests, to see, not gatekeeping, because we're not doing the gatekeeping thing, but it is education and then assessment on how far can you go with this movement towards, Black liberation, Black sovereignty, self-determination, etc. But yes, everybody can't go.
Right.
Amazing. So now I have this question to ask, which may be a little bit thought-provoking, but in workplace, if you are experiencing colorism at the hands of another Black person, as it's defined, do you speak up officially? Do you document it? Do you follow the chain of command to seek remedy? How do you manage that in the structure of HR and reporting at work? Or do you?
I'd say definitely document it and definitely report it and definitely speak out against it, not because you're facing that type of racism, because it is a form of racism that you're going to give that person a pass. No, I think it's something that you definitely need to bring to that person's attention and document it. And definitely, if it continues, I would say, bring it to HR. Why give them a pass?
Sure. I absolutely think document, hands down, dates, all that. I think that, the system protects itself. So I think there's some strategy, and power concedes nothing without a demand. So I think me personally, I would be remiss to just say, document and go through the HR channel. Document and go through no. The system protects itself, okay? And you will be sacrificed quickly. That's my personal experience. So I think you document, you get in community, right? You need some allies where now there's some pressure for action. And this is not just some internalized situation that they can just leverage. Because what I've seen in leadership, whether it's Black folks, white folks, whoever, is if there's an interpersonal situation, those in a higher power will make this about you and not just another individual. It makes it about you, and now it's the organization.
Yeah.
They feel like they are, and now it's the board, now it's the, so power dynamics. So there's a little bit more strategy, in my opinion. Definitely document, but you need to pull in allies and resources and be connected to community.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think both, when you talk about being sacrificed, I think sometimes in these systems, they'll easily sacrifice both people.
Yeah. Oh, they love
spaces. The spaces aren't built for you anyway. And so give them a reason.
They will.
Yes.
They will. And they that's a play. That's a playbook. Oh, Black folk division. Okay, we're gonna get you, and then we're gonna get you, because we don't need much out here anyway.
We don't want you anyway. Yeah. So let me just run down a couple of things, and we'll give you guys some time to wrap up. So obviously, educate yourself, be aware of biases, understand what colorism is, be able to talk about it openly, be able to teach the next generation what it is. It says to reflect and share personal experiences. And so even the experiences that you all shared tonight with me was informative, created a different sense of understanding. And so we have to continue to share our stories, engage in honest conversations with one another, speak up. And then I'm going to end on this and then give it to you all to each give some closing remarks. But this says support each other, build networks of support and allyship with other Black individuals and colleagues, understanding that most of them are affected by colorism. Collaborate, create supportive and inclusive relationships, work together so that we can start to break down these obstacles and barriers together. And, one thing for me when I'm out and about professionally is that I noticed that Black people, there was a time when you saw another Black person, especially in a space that was not populated heavily with Black people, you spoke.
Right.
You put your hand up, you gave your head nod. That was obligatory. Like, that's what you did. And I noticed that doesn't even exist anymore. Like, maybe it's that fly under the radar, maybe it's whatever the case is, but maybe it's competition. But I think the concept of supporting each other in Black community is super important and probably a really simple way to start. So I'd love to go back around for each of you to kind of give your closing remarks and maybe land on how we can support each other and build community. And as we close the webinar tonight. So let's start with you, Michelle.
Yeah, I would say definitely if you see something, say something, right? So if you notice it, don't just, ignore it, whether it be in your friend circle or in a professional environment at work. Definitely speak up, right? And help that person understand. Maybe they're unaware what they're doing or what colorism is, but just, bring it to the forefront. That's would be my advice.
Yeah.
And Sharonda?
I would say education is the key, us sticking together, us getting more involved in the community, and truly embrace our young people, because some of them have no idea. They don't know their history. They may not be familiar with what is colorism. And when they are faced with it, then they start acting buffoonery, so we have got to education starting at our babies. If it's a teenage baby, still, embrace that individual, but education and just enlightening and getting involved in the community to build, our allies.
Yeah, I wanna end with this quote from Zora Neale Hurston.
My favorite author.
Yeah, she says, if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. So I think that we have a responsibility to be very audacious and calling out all symptoms of white supremacy, and colorism is a symptom of white supremacy. And even if we have to check each other internally, if we have to check each other when nobody is around, there's features that I know that I get complimented on with myself that are it's based on a white normative, right? And I'll say, so what does good hair mean, right? What is that, right? So like, how do you address, you have to address it even in-house, right? I think being in community is the key. You have to let folks know what's going on. You have to be in Black spaces. You have to create allies, and think about strategy on how do you navigate colorism in the workplace, for sure. And again, Sharonda, education for sure.
Absolutely.
I just would like to take the time to thank all of you for your time, your insight, and your contributions to this sensitive but very powerful and needed discussion tonight around colorism. We're just scratching the surface of being able to talk about this topic, and then to take some of the steps that we talked about toward healing and to start to put them in place. So thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you, all of you, for joining ABC's Equity at Work webinar. We will reconvene in July, where our topic will be redefining professionalism. And so we'll be excited to see you back in July. And thank you for joining Associated Black Charities. Good night.
Have a good night.
Good night.